Hello and welcome back to Gardens from the Ground Up. My name is Lindsay and today's episode is called Designing the Space. I'm so excited to share this with you. Design is one of my passions. I am a graphic designer by day and designing spaces, especially gardens, is so rewarding and it's just really fun. So let's get started. So the first thing you want to consider when you are designing your garden space is what type of garden do you want to do? Are you going to be doing an in-ground garden? Are you going to be using raised beds? Are you going to be doing a little bit of both? After you've figured that out, then comes the fun part of designing the space that you want. The most important thing is to design a space that you love. Designing a space is something that should make it feel inviting to you and make you want to spend time in your garden. That's super important. If you don't want to spend time in the garden, it will become neglected and then you'll be sad. So make sure you design a space you love. Then decide what style of garden you want. Do you want to do like a more potager type garden that incorporates ornamentals and has hardscape aspects and different elements to make it appealing to the eye as much as to, well, the stomach, really? Do you want to do something that's more production based with rows and maybe quadrants? You don't really care about the style of the space, you just want it to grow as much food as possible. A production garden might be exactly what you're looking for. Or you could do something kind of in between. You could do something that is beautiful and has style and has some hardscape elements to it, but also produces a ton of food. And I like to marry those two styles together. I very much love a potager style garden. If you saw the garden at my last house, it was very much both. It was a potager style with the beautiful archways covered in vines and the cattle panels holding up the tomatoes and the flowers, but it also produced a lot of food. So that's kind of the style I'm going to be incorporating here as well. But I think it's going to be a little more potager versus production this time because I have so much more space to consider. So think about that when you are designing your space. Try to figure out what your style is in terms of your garden. Do you just want it to make food, or do you want it to make food and also be beautiful? So when I'm designing a garden space, and I did this for my last garden and I'm going to do it again here, I like to start from the outside in. So I like to start with my fencing, my gates, that type of thing, and work my way into the middle of the garden. So I'm going to show you what my garden looks like now. Well, you can kind of see it, but this is an overview of what our house looks like. I just pulled this image from Google Maps. I just turned on the satellite view and zoomed in as far as I could and took a screenshot. And this is what my backyard looks like. So this is kind of the space I have set up, or I've set aside to create my garden space in. We do have a pretty big deck and we do want to keep some green space, so I am not using the whole backyard, but I am using a pretty big portion of it for garden. So the first thing I think about is fencing, because I do have critters that I have to contend with, so I do need to have fencing. And for me, we do have a privacy fence, so knowing where the posts for the privacy fence are really comes in handy for me, because I am going to be attaching the ends of my fence to the privacy fence posts, if that makes sense. So this is kind of where I'm thinking I'm going to put my fence. I have measured this out, but now this illustration is probably not to scale by any means, but this just helps visually show where my space is going to be. So I have my fence. I'm going to have two gates. I'm going to have one that is bigger and one that is a little bit smaller on each end of the garden. So the big one is going to be 4 feet wide. It's going to have two gates that actually open like this. And then the other one is just going to be 2 feet wide, and that is going to have access to the garage from that, so I don't have to walk all the way around. Now for fencing, I am using 3-foot fence for this garden. In the past I've used 2-foot fence, but I decided to go with 3-foot fence just to make my life a little bit easier. So my gates will be 3 feet tall as well. Now I do have my greenhouse in here. So the greenhouse is up here, and it's not super centered in the middle of the garden space right now. I don't know if I'm going to scoot it over. I may leave it where it is actually, and just have a wider space over to the left of the garden or the greenhouse for long trailing things. I kind of really want to try to grow watermelons next year, and so I'm thinking that that space next to the greenhouse may be where the watermelons go. So I have my greenhouse in there. I also have the 3 raised planter beds, and I want to move those down here in this little diagonal space. Now the diagonal space for me makes sense because I want to make sure that I have enough walking space from my gate to the rest of the yard. If someone comes in through the gate, they can get to the deck with enough space and not make it feel claustrophobic over there. So that's why I have this little diagonal piece of fence. And in that little area, I'm going to put a little table with a couple chairs, just so I have a place to kind of sit and reflect and look at my garden, or just enjoy a cup of coffee out there, or sit my tools down, or, you know, whatever. So I'm gonna have that in this little area. And then I have the whole rest of the garden to play with. I am going to be doing a pathing system. So I do know that I am gonna have a path from the gates to the greenhouse. And other than that, I'm not really sure yet. So that's where the next step comes in. What other aspects are you going to be adding to your garden? So I have 4 cattle panels, and I am going to turn at least 2 of them into arches again. The thing with archways that you have to keep in mind is you want to make sure that you're not going to be obstructing the sunlight from any other plants. The other thing to keep in mind is what you are planting when during the year. So north is this way on this photo and south is this way on this screenshot. So my house faces south. The sun moves to the south in the wintertime here in the United States. For me, this bottom part of the garden will be in the shade in the early part of the spring. So I'm not really going to want to plant anything that needs sunlight in the early spring, like peas, any type of like leafy green, root vegetables. I'm not gonna wanna plant those in this south part of the garden because they will not have enough sun. So I wanna plant those more towards the north end of the garden. You see where I'm going with this? There's lots of aspects you have to think about when you're planning your garden. So the best way that I have figured out how to do this is to just make a list of everything you want to grow, not necessarily that you're going to grow, but that you'd like to grow, and determine where the best place for them is. So after you have your space kind of sketched out, and you can sketch this out in so many different ways. I actually use my iPad with my Apple Pencil in an app called GoodNotes. And I actually imported that screenshot of my backyard into GoodNotes, and I can draw on top of it, erase, start over, whatever. If you are doing a more like rectangular space, you could use graph paper. You can use, I've seen people use Excel. I don't like to use Excel because I hate it, and I don't use it unless I absolutely have to. But if you're one of those people that likes it, sure, go ahead, I don't know. If you are doing like square foot gardening, actually using something like Excel might be perfect for you because you could make everything like 1 foot squares. But yeah, I mean, take a screenshot of your property on Google Earth or Google Maps, print it out, draw on it, you know, whatever. I know it helps me to see things visually like this, to kind of get a feel of where I'm gonna put stuff. Now, keep in mind that it could change. You'll probably change your mind 100 times. I know I've already changed my design for my garden like 4 or 5 times since we bought this house, and it'll probably change 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more times before next spring comes and I actually create the garden space. So that is something also to remember, that nothing is set in stone until, I mean, it is set in stone, I guess. When you're in the designing phase, nothing is permanent. You can move stuff, you can redo stuff, you can do crazy stuff. You know, your mind, your imagination is your best friend when it comes to designing your garden space. So make sure to keep that in mind, especially if you want to do something a little bit more visually appealing. If you want to do a production garden with rows, those are super easy. Make sure that you're taking into account the sun and where it comes up over your garden. Don't put your tallest plants in a space where it's gonna shade the rest of your plants. Make sure everything gets the right amount of sunlight and plant away. So that's really easy. I do love a production garden. I think they can be beautiful, especially if they're maintained well. But for me, I love like a beautiful, overwhelmingly like lush space. And that is kind of the goal I'm going for here next year. I am going to be using a pathway system, fencing. I'm gonna try to make my fence look nice and not just like some chicken wire on some T-posts, you know? So that's kind of my goal. I want it to look visually appealing as well. So these are some things that I'm going through in my head. What do I want to make sure that my garden has in terms of other elements? Like I have my greenhouse. I'm going to be, hopefully, next spring or this fall at some point, getting a little table and chairs to put out here. I have my 3 raised planter beds. I have decor that I like to put in my garden. I have like shepherd's hooks that I will hang pots on. I have all kinds of stuff like that I like to have in my garden. So I like to make sure that I have the space for those to see them because I like them and they make me happy. So overall, the keys here when it comes to designing your space is decide what type of garden you want. Raised beds, in-ground, both, maybe containers, whatever. Decide what style of garden you want. Do you want a potager style garden that is beautiful and has hardscape elements and ornamental plants and that type of thing? Do you want a strictly production garden where it's just food plants in rows or in quadrants? And really just create a space that you love. Like I said, if you don't love the space, it's not going to draw you to it. And if you are not drawn to your garden, the chances of it being neglected are much higher. So speaking from experience on that one, it is much easier to neglect a garden that you don't love. So create a space you love and it will feel less like work when you have to pull weeds in July when it's 90 degrees outside. Ask me how I know that. So I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. As always, I am here to help. I love designing spaces. I love designing garden spaces. They are so flexible and beautiful and wonderful. So thank you so much for joining me for episode 2 of Gardens from the Ground Up. And I will see you in the next one.